Okay, for this tutorial, we're going to look at a series of methods we can use on strings. So I have three variable strings: phrase, which contains who lives in a pineapple under the sea; name, which contains SpongeBob SquarePants; and num, which contains 2020 as a string. So I have those quotations around it, so it's not reading that as an integer, it's reading that as a string. I've just went ahead and ran all these so we can just see the results. Remember when we were looking at the format operator, the percent sign, we learned about the field widths. So basically a dot center, we take the variable that we want to use it on, dot center, the method, just very similar to what we did with JavaScript. And then in parentheses, we give it the value of the column width, in this case 20. And it centers that text in 20, basically 20 spaces. It'll center what it prints out, which is 2020. In the count method, it will count the instances of whatever you tell it in parentheses. I put a capital S here. So if we look at name, there are two capital S's, and if we come over here, yes, indeed, it did return a capital, or two, because there were two capital S's. The next method is starts with. I put starts with capital S in our parentheses. We're looking at name, and name it does indeed start with a capital S, so that returned true. But when I tried that with num does not start with a capital S, so it returned false. Ends with works similar to starts with. I said ends with a question mark for the phrase, which it indeed does, so it returned true. And then I said ends with an S for phrase. Well, that's false. So return false. We can also use a find method. So in name, I put find Bob. And then it returned a 6. Well, that's weird. What do you think that 6 represents? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It returned the starting index value for the phrase that we put in parentheses. Is alpha returns a true if the phrase contains all alphabetic characters. So phrase has a question mark, so it returned false. But there's no special characters in name, and it also returned false. Well, it's right here. It also returned false. Why? It did count that space. So is alpha will return false if there are spaces in the phrase or in the string. If we remove that space and ran this program again, it would return true for is alpha. Is digit returns true if it contains numbers. So for our num variable, it's 2020, and those are all digits, so it did return true. And then we can use a dot lower to change that whole string to lowercase. We can use dot upper to change the whole string to uppercase. Okay? Now let's look at some methods that are a little more complex. And these, I have similar phrases: who lives in a pineapple under the sea. I have name, but I have a lot of extra white space in there, you see. So let's see what these do. Sorry about the continuity error. I made a mistake, but I'm not re-recording the whole thing. So let's look at some other methods. If we used a split method, that would split our original string wherever we told it to split, and then store those in a list. So I said split based on a space, so it's going to take each individual word in that phrase and store it as a different string in a list, and we'll talk about lists in the next chapter. Just kind of think of it as like an array right now. All right, the replace method will replace something that you tell it to with something else. So I said replace every instance of a 0 with a 1. So it returned 2120, 2121, because it replaced every 0 with a 1. You could also use the replace and then use a third argument and tell it, hey, only replace the first instance of a 0 with a 1. So in this case, it returned 2120. The strip method will take away any trailing or leading white space. So in this case, I have a whole bunch of spaces in front of SpongeBob SquarePants. It strips those extra spaces off and then just returns the phrase. And we also have a join, which will concatenate. So it helps if you can actually see the code that I'm talking about in the video, so I had to edit. In this case, the join method will concatenate two things together, two strings together. So I created a variable called dash, and I'm storing a dash in it. And then I use the .join method with the phrase as an argument. So the phrase "who lives in a pineapple." So then it concatenates that dash after each index value. So after 0, it put a dash. After 1, it put a dash. After O, it put a dash. So on and so forth.